And welcome to the 2020-2021 academic year PIPE workshop. So this fall, we're going to be doing the PIPE workshop by Zoom, which is different than in the past. So there might be some kinks that we have to work out along the way, but we'll be fine, and we've got a great lineup. And what Zoom did allow me to do was to reach out beyond the LA area and invite some people from across the country. So we have a nice group of speakers for the fall, and I'm lining up another good group of speakers for the spring. And today we have as the opener for the academic year, Michael Hankinson. Michael is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. Prior to starting at GW in 2020, he was on faculty at Baruch College, CUNY for 2 years. Received his PhD in government and social policy from Harvard University in 2017. Michael studies how institutional spatial scale affects political behavior to undermine democratic representation. He uses original data to show that collective outcomes in housing, health policy, and voting behavior are all shaped by the spatial scale of institutions. Previous research has suggested that when institutions are designed to shift power to smaller spatial scales, they may result in normatively positive outcomes. His research indicates that the smaller spatial scale of institutions may change political behavior in ways that prevent the development of needed public goods, such as housing and public health infrastructure. In short, the design of political institutions can subvert representation and collective action around the citing of things society needs, but nobody wants nearby. Methodologically, he leverages geocodable observational data, as well as original survey and experimental approaches. His research has been published in the American Political Science Review and Social Forces. Before I turn it over to Michael, I'll just say that the chat box is open. If you have questions along the way, type them in the chat box, and a couple of us, Michael and I, will be able to see what you're asking. I think at the end we might try the hands up feature. This is all new to me, right? All this stuff is new to me, but we'll make it happen. So over to Michael.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I want to talk to you today about the spatial scale of our electoral institutions. And through new research in collaboration with Asi Magazinik of MIT, I want to convince you that the scale at which we aggregate voters to select elected officials directly affects not only representation, but also policy outcomes. Specifically, it affects this trade-off that I talk about in the title, the trade-off between the supply of public goods and equity in how the costs of those goods are distributed. Now, what I mean by costs is referring to the fact that many of our public goods have spatially concentrated costs. For example, in a paper with Justin Benedictus Kessner, we find bipartisan support for increasing funding for opioid addiction treatment. But we also find bipartisan opposition to the opening of a new treatment clinic in one's own community. Another example, we see increasing national public support for climate change action, but at the same time here in Falmouth, Massachusetts, local opposition to the needed clean energy infrastructure to respond to the crisis. And finally, in the topic that we're going to be looking at today, housing. My research has shown not only do we see local opposition to new homes and apartments among homeowners, as we may expect, but I find that opposition exists among renters in expensive communities towards market rate housing. And these are renters who still support large increases in the housing supply citywide. So this not in my backyard attitude or NIMBY attitude is very well captured in this image. This is an actual photo from Minneapolis where we see on one hand, all are welcome here. On the other hand, don't bulldoze our neighborhoods, in reference to Minneapolis policy that allows 2, 3, and 4 unit developments in existing single family neighborhoods with the tagline minneapolisforeveryone.org. Now, all these policies are just examples, a few of the examples of these public goods with spatially concentrated costs. But what I want to argue is for a general theory about these types of policies. And that is when you have spatially concentrated costs, the spatial scale of representation matters. Whether the decision makers are elected at the neighborhood level, the city level, the state or federal level, directly affects this trade-off between the supply of that public good and the equity in the distribution of that good's costs. And the example I want to share with you today comes from new work with Asi Magazinik, where we are looking at the transition from at-large or citywide elections to the smaller scale of district elections. My beautiful slides in the introduction. Here we have opioids, clean energy infrastructure, and the example from Minneapolis. Okay, so pulling this together, the theory is that when you have these concentrated costs, the representation matters. And this is where we left off, that the example we're looking at is the shift from at-large to district elections. And specifically, what I'm going to argue and hopefully convince you of is that when this shift exists, in cities that shift to the smaller scale of representation, we see less supply, a decrease in the permitting of new housing, but more equity. The housing that is permitted is more evenly distributed across white and minority neighborhoods within the same city. So let's give a brief refresher of what I mean by at-large versus district elections to kind of visualize this theory. If you lived in an at-large city, that means that the city council is elected from all members, all citizens within that city's boundaries. So here we have the boundaries. Is my the pointer showing up here? Okay, great. So I have a pointer. So if you lived in the city, you would see this type of ballot. You can vote for no more than 4 candidates, and as a result, you'd have a say over all 4 seats of city council. But you can take that same city, the same voters, and slice them into 4 districts. So here, let's say you lived in District 1, your ballot would look something like this. You can vote for one of these 2 candidates, and as a result, you'd have a say over one of the seats on city council. Now, this may seem like kind of an arbitrary difference, but we can look at cues to think about who would prefer which type of electoral institution. Now, I kid you not, this is the first image that shows up on Google image search for district elections, California. And we can see people at this local meeting protesting this switch to district elections. And there's a few things that we can see in common here. They're all generally above the middle-aged. They all have the same sign, so maybe they're organized. But also, as far as I can tell, they are all white. So why would white residents prefer at-large elections to district elections? If we go back to the history of the at-large institution, it comes from the progressive era in response to the machine-style politics of East Coast cities. And there was the primary reason this was put forward was the belief that city councilors who were elected at large would be responsive to citywide interests and therefore be better caretakers of city finances and city policy as a whole. But there was a less openly stated reason for preferring at-large elections, and that was that they would limit the representation of ethnic minorities. The theory goes that if you have a white voting majority, so 50% plus 1, and those white voters vote exclusively for white city council candidates, what we call racially polarized voting, they can secure an all-white city council. And indeed, there's evidence, recent evidence from looking at the reforms I'm looking at today, that the shift to district elections does increase descriptive representation of minorities, albeit conditionally so. So we can go back to our cities from the last model and try to visualize how this works. Here we have the at-large city again, but now we have a majority white city, 60% white in the northern part of the city, and 40% of the city's residents are Black, as represented here on the southern part of the city. If the white voters vote exclusively for white city council candidates, they can elect an all-white city council. However, we can take the same city, the same voters, and slice them now into 4 districts. And we see something different occur. Now in districts 1 and 2, they are 100% white, so they will elect white city council members. But districts 3 and 4 are majority minority. And as a result, just by slicing that city into different districts, we get a city council that is more descriptively representative of the underlying racial population. Same voters, just a different institutional form. Now, other effects come from the shift to district elections. It's not just a change in representation. Part of the features of American city politics is that cities generally lack strong party competition. Because they don't have these two strong parties, it's really hard for city councils to solve some of these bargaining challenges over time. And as a result, cities with district elections tend to adopt what we call universal log rolls, meaning each council member controls the issues specific to their district. So think about it this way: if we are all a city council and something is proposed for my neighborhood, my district that I don't like, rather than using your majority rule to think about the interests of the city, you're all going to defer to what I want and help me vote that thing down. Because each of you knows that when it comes to your own district, we'll all support you in blocking that thing that you don't want. And that, as a result, we can all kind of protect each other in our next election campaign. Clearly, this creates some problems around collective action. In fact, it's such a big issue that in her first day in office, Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago signed an executive order, quote, ending the unilateral, unchecked power that aldermen have to control virtually every aspect of business and community life that interacts with the city. When asked for comment, long-term alderman Anthony Beal said that this order was not worth the paper it's written on. In other words, you can say what you want. We have a system that works and we're going to keep doing it. So we can think about these two effects. This shift to district elections can matter for representation. It can matter for log rolling outcomes. And there's evidence that it can affect citywide policy outcomes, such as citywide finances. What I want to talk to you about today is spatially concentrated costs. And the type of policy that I'm going to be looking at is housing as our dependent variable for several reasons. First, as I've shown in previous work, housing elicits a incredibly strong not in my backyard effect. It has these heavily concentrated costs, not only felt by homeowners, but often by renters, particularly in expensive environments. Second, housing is an issue that's controlled almost exclusively by local governments. So you can think that a change in the institutional form at the local level is going to have measurable effects on housing. Also, housing is continuously and frequently permitted. So while the same theory we believe applies for things like trash incinerators or landfills, those are permitted every couple of decades, making it very hard to observe these causal effects, whereas housing, we think, will allow us to measure these effects. And finally, there's a host of normative reasons we should care about the political economy of housing. There's substantial evidence that these types of constraints on a housing supply increase existing rents, limit access to areas of high upward economic mobility. They entrench existing patterns of racial segregation, slow local and regional economic growth, and finally increase greenhouse gas emissions per capita, because when you can't build in more dense fashions, you have to build farther and farther out, increasing transportation fuel use. So we can put all this together. What are these effects of descriptive representation and log rolls on housing as our policy outcome of choice? Again, we're revisiting our favorite city here. We have the racial populations and city councils that exist. If we think about where housing is going to wind up when it comes to this city with a diverse population, but an all-white city council. Well, if housing is a concentrated cost, it's probably going to wind up in the area least able to block it, which means it's going to wind up in the Black neighborhoods on the south side of the city. But if we go to our city with district elections, we can think about housing being proposed, say, in the first district. If the council member of District 1 does not like that housing, the log roll means that everyone's going to vote alongside that council member, and that housing is going to be vetoed or blocked. So it goes to District 2, they're part of the log roll as well, it gets blocked. Now District 3, the minority neighborhood, is now part of the log roll. They have representation. And with a seat at the table, they are also better able to block the housing, and so on with District 4. So we can see that the shift to district elections has two potential outcomes, or two things going on at the same time. One, we see less housing being permitted annually because there's no kind of dumping ground to channel the housing into, no area that lacks representation. But as a result, it means that the housing that does get through is most likely going to be more evenly distributed than under the at-large system, where it could just be channeled into the politically weakest communities. Okay, so this theory that I put forward, it looks very straightforward, but as we know, there's always problems with measuring causal effects. I'm proposing that the switch to district elections will lead to this decrease in the housing supply permitted annually. But we know that plenty of other things may affect that housing supply. Cities' preferences towards growth may also cause a decrease in the housing supply. And this really wouldn't be a problem for identification unless that preference for slower growth also causes cities to adopt district elections. Now all of a sudden we have a classic problem with a confounding variable and makes us wonder, can we actually measure this causal effect? Well, Asi and I believe we've found an opportunity to break this problem of endogeneity, and that's from the California Voting Rights Act. So the CVRA builds on the existing Voting Rights Act by allowing the pursuit of litigation around electoral discrimination, but it lowers the burden of proof for saying that an at-large electoral institution is discriminatory. Importantly for our design, this allows firms to pressure cities to switch to district elections, and they are very effective at it. Any city that has tried to resist has lost in court and has racked up millions of dollars in legal fees. I think Santa Monica is particularly trying to drag this out for as long as possible and continues to lose on appeals. The effect of this, though, means that every other city in California is terrified of being taken to court. Thus, we've seen from 2010 to 2018 this massive increase in cities adopting district elections. In 2010, at the start of our panel, 7% of California cities had districts. By 2018, the end of our panel, nearly a third of California municipalities had district elections. And importantly, this fear of litigation, this pressure to switch, is creating what we believe to be a conditionally exogenous switch to districts. And we say that for two reasons. One is that in looking at city council meeting minutes and reporting about this institutional reform, we found no discussion of housing preferences and growth affecting this decision to switch to district elections. It's just coming from this threat of litigation and the expense incurred of it. But also we're going to present evidence from a subset of cities that are eventually treated, meaning they've either already switched or they have agreed to switch in the next few years. We think that this subset provides the best case for identification, because these are the cities that firms are targeting for litigation. In other words, firms have this bevy of cases that they know they're going to win and just simply have a bottleneck in terms of taking them to court and sending the right letters to start the litigation process. Having interviewed these firms, we find that this subset of cities with a substantial Latino population and a population over 50,000 individuals, that is the group that they are targeting. And once we subset to that group, we find that the timing of these conversions to district elections is as if random. And this is using a standard survival model that we include in the paper. So we have two sets of results, the full sample of California cities and how this conversion plays out, but also this subset that we feel very confident about when it comes to causal identification of similar cities. Just to visualize this shift over time, we can see at the start of these conversions, these are the cities that had district elections in California, and we see the spread across the state by 2019, and it's continually accelerating actually in 2019 and 2020. Okay, so we have two tests here. The first question is, does this affect the supply? Do district elections cause a decrease in the permitting of new housing? The treatment is the switch to district elections, and we have evidence from nearly 500 municipalities in California. Our treatment is going to be that year of the first district election for city council, and the outcome is going to be the log annual units permitted from the Census Building Permits Survey. So we have a 9-year panel here of housing permits issued. Importantly, both in terms of granularity and to test our theory, we can split these permits into both single family and multifamily housing. This is important because of how that housing comes online. Single family units are permitted by right. And what that means is that if you're a developer and you want to build single family housing, generally speaking, you submit your application, it gets checked for administrative review, does it comply with existing codes? And if it does, boom, you got development. Multifamily housing, though, goes through discretionary review. And this is where things get political. If you want to build an apartment, multifamily development, you can submit your proposal, it goes through administrative review, and then it goes in front of the planning commission. These are individuals appointed by city council to make legislative decisions over what to allow when it comes to multifamily development. Now, even if you get a positive vote by the Planning Commission, frequently buildings in California go in front of the city council itself, who also has to give a majority approval to your development before getting approved. We think this juncture here of the Planning Commission vote and the city council vote provide the opportunity for political groups that now have more representation under districts to exercise their pushback and cause the city council to substantially scale back or even veto development proposals that they do not like. So if anything's going to be happening here, we expect it in multifamily units, not the single family units. Okay, so reviewing our model, we have a standard difference in differences framework with city and year fixed effects, as well as city-specific time trends. We also include, as a heads up, I got a chat. There's something about the cities able to track Latinos that also affect the outcome variable. The assumption is that this may be easier doing it verbally. So the question is there something about the cities in the sample that attract Latinos that also affect the outcome variable? I would say no, because we're not experiencing shifts in population over time that are causing the conversion to district elections that is also affecting the housing outcomes. And when we look at pre-treatment trends, and it's in the appendix, I'm happy to take a deeper look at it during the Q&A. We find no difference in pre-treatment trends between control and treated cities when it comes to their housing production. So it doesn't seem like something is leading to a growth in Latino population, which drives conversion, but it's also affecting housing trends. We also include a number of time-varying controls from the ACS, things that may be affecting the preferences for the housing supply, as well as the general housing market. And finally, we're going to cluster our standard errors at the city level. So here are the main results. Here's the main takeaway. We're going to look at housing outcomes for total permits issued, as well as single and multifamily separated. And our outcome variable is the percent change in units permitted. So anything negative means that once cities shift to district elections, they are permitting less new housing each year. So the first result is when it comes to overall housing permits issued, we see a 21% decrease in total units permitted, although it's a little noisy. This effect is not statistically significant at conventional levels. However, when we separate it into single family, multifamily, we see a big difference in those two groups. We find a almost precise null effect on single family units permitted. And this theoretically makes sense. The single family housing does not get exposed to political pressure through this legislative process of a planning commission vote and a city council vote. But also, generally speaking, single family housing is seen as more benign and also is likely to be built in the outskirts of a city where there are fewer neighbors to protest it. On the other hand, we find a 48% decrease in the permitting of multifamily units once a city shifts to district elections. And this makes sense. These are the permits that that are subject to political pressure from the city council, and therefore they'd be subject to the institutional effects of district elections. Now, we want to test this also in our eventually treated subset, the group that we think has the best case for identification here. When we look at this by each group, we find the effects are not only stronger for multifamily housing, but we still receive this almost precise, pretty precise null effect on single family housing, which is what we'd expect theoretically. So the first set of results shows that we see this decrease in supply that we would theoretically expect from the shift to district elections. These neighborhoods that may be targeted have a greater ability to push back on development they don't like. And because of log rolling, everyone goes along with it. But what about equity in the distribution of costs? Do district elections cause housing to be more equitably distributed? Well, this requires something tricky. it requires us to know where these housing units are going within each city. And believe it or not, this data does not exist in any useful format. This required us to do a deep dive into specific cities and go through the meeting minutes to figure out the exact addresses of each unit being voted on. So we had to narrow it down. We chose a sample of 6 cities within California, 3 that were treated that had substantial number of years post-treatment, and then matched those to 3 control cities. Now, hopefully these cities look like, adequate matches just to account for unobservable characteristics for those of you in California. But importantly, none of our models require exact matching between these cities. All of these data points are going to be pulled together into one model. We're just trying to account for potential unobservables. So in terms of how I spent, not this summer, but last summer, it was reading every planning commission meeting and city council meeting across an 8-year period for these 6 cities. It was around 2,000 meetings. And geocoding every development that was permitted within these cities, as well as every neighborhood-wide rezoning, anything that would increase the buildable capacity of these cities. We aggregate these units to block group covariates, and this is the universe of legislative decisions about housing within these cities, an 8-year panel of over 200 block groups in 6 cities. Just to give you a small taste of what this looks like, these are the meeting minutes. We can see this development is 126 units. We can see it's on a 2.5-acre parcel, so that is certainly multifamily housing, but if I had doubt, I could Google Street View it just to confirm. It's at 700 West Grand Avenue, and the motion carried, meaning that it's going to be in our data set. What this allows us to do is spatially measure the allocation of housing. Here we have Escondido, and we have the average distribution of housing units within Escondido in its at-large years within our panel. We can see that housing is concentrated here in the downtown area of Escondido, and it's concentrated at a level that's statistically significant using a Moran's I, which is a geographic measure of clustering. When Escondido switched to district elections, we see that clustering no longer exists. Housing under Escondido's district elected years is more evenly distributed towards the outskirts of the city in a way that's no longer statistically significantly concentrated. This is just one example that illustrates the theory, but we can do better by modeling this. So the question is, are district elections going to cause housing to be more equitably distributed? To do this, we need to compare white and minority neighborhoods within the same city. So under at-large elections, is housing being channeled disproportionately into minority neighborhoods? And under districts, does that channeling of housing end in the way we would expect? To define this, we're going to define the minority versus white neighborhoods based on terciles. So the top tercile of block groups when it comes to non-white composition is a minority neighborhood. And the bottom tercile is going to be considered a white neighborhood. Our sample of 6 cities is now pooled together into one model. Our outcome is any increase in the buildable capacity that goes through the discretionary review process. These are all the decisions that have legislative fingerprints on them. And our treatment is, again, the switch to district elections, but now we have an indicator for whether that is housing going into a minority neighborhood. This allows us to compare white minority neighborhoods under both types of institutions, at large and district. We're going to use the same difference in differences framework as before, the same specifications, the same controls. Now we are clustering our standard errors at the city level using a wild bootstrap. And we can see what these outcomes look like under both types of institutions. Again, using city fixed effects, we're comparing white and minority neighborhoods within the same city, also controlling for changes in the local housing market. So on the left, we're going to look at where's housing going under at-large institutions. On our y-axis, we have the percent difference in units approved between white and minority neighborhoods. So any positive effect here means that minority neighborhoods are taking on more housing than their white counterparts in the same city. Under at-large elections, we see that's the case. We see that 44% more units are being approved in minority neighborhoods when it's at-large representation. However, when cities shift to district elections, that effect disappears. once each neighborhood has a seat at the table, the ability to join in this log roll, we see no difference in the share of housing going to minority neighborhoods versus their white counterparts, all else equal. So this is the model that we started with. When you have concentrated costs, the spatial scale of representation matters. The evidence I presented is that in the example of at-large district elections within a city, we see less supply coming online. People are more able to veto that housing that they don't like, and the log roll permits it. But we also see more equity. Housing is no longer being channeled into the politically weakest neighborhoods that previously lacked descriptive representation. Now, this is a big question, though. Normatively, what should we think about these outcomes? Is there does this short-term increase in equity, does immediate increase in equity risk long-term affordability for these cities? Because housing is not coming online in a way that can meet growing demand. This is a big problem, and it extends beyond the city council offices. This is a headline recently from the LA Times. Sky-high rents and home prices are making it hard for Southern California businesses to attract workers. This has reached the governor's desk, and a concern about how can the state use pressure to allow housing to meet demand in these cities. Well, one idea is that maybe the state can pressure cities by pulling back resources. Governor Newsom here is threatening to withhold transportation, gas tax money, if these cities do not permit enough housing, because he sees the connection between if cities don't build, housing, transportation costs get more expensive as suburban sprawl increases. Well, we can think about the policy outcomes of this proposed design. If the state, in a top-down manner, tries to push new housing into these cities, how is that going to interact with this institutional reform? Well, we can visit these cities one more time. Here we have the at-large city on the left. If the governor's office tries to push in a housing mandate, we imagine that housing is probably going to wind up where housing has always wound up in these cities, concentrated in the minority neighborhoods that lack representation on city council. But under districts, we can see that housing winding up differently. Pushed through, but now with each neighborhood having a seat at the table and being forced to figure out where to put the housing, that housing is going to come online, but do so in a way that is equitably distributed when it comes to its costs. In other words, this may be potential to secure both goals. The top-down mandate plus the small scale of representation that we are seeing expand within California leads to both supply and equity. So wrapping up, this is the general theory, and we have several projects in the pipeline. As I mentioned at the start of this, Asya and I have received external funding from the Russell Sage Foundation, so we're going to be looking at the consequences of spatial scale in California for quite some time. Our questions include, how is this reform affecting the composition of city councils, not only on a race and ethnicity factor, but also in terms of the income of the city council members winning election, using their housing values as a proxy, and also where in the city they're coming from, what types of neighborhoods are now achieving representation. Second, is this affecting the mobilization of minorities within these cities now that they have a seat at the table, as well as how are these districts being drawn to begin with? We've heard plenty of stories through our fieldwork of shady gerrymandering when it came to preserving existing council seats. And finally, I'm very excited about California now actually doing the geocoding for me with every new housing development coming online, which will save me plenty of time once that data is posted. But we also need to look at the spatially concentrated costs. In the path ahead, we're looking at a more generalized theory about these concentrated costs, a unified theory of NIMBYism. How can we categorize these types of costs? And whether different reforms could be useful. Is compensation useful in terms of achieving policy outcomes? Through a new survey tool, we're changing the streetscapes to simulate changes and seeing if people will accept payments and be more inclined to support these types of developments. Or whether fairness in the decision-making process. Are there institutional reforms that can limit free riding, therefore win more popular support for these types of proposals? And finally, do we see local activation? Are there effects of these types of developments coming online that is spurring differential turnout among groups nearby versus groups far away in a way that interacts with the political process? But I just want to close saying that in achieving both equity in the costs and the supply of these public goods. I'm very much inspired by Eleanor Ostrom's work on common pool resource problems. And she had a saying that something that works in practice works in theory. In other words, maybe we can learn from existing institutions that seem to do a better job of balancing these two outcomes than what we've currently seen in the United States. But both these things are entwined, the costs themselves and the spatial scale of representation. And we need to look at both in unity if we're ever going to try to achieve both equity and supply when it comes to these things that society desperately needs, but few of us want them nearby. With that, I'm excited about the questions. I know that it's been hard to juggle the chat box, so I'm looking forward to hands being raised.
I just wanted you to talk about the at-large to district logic on log rolling. You'd mentioned at the beginning that there are no parties, there's incentives for log rolling, but it seems like some of those incentives would exist with at-large districts too. And there's some older literature by Rory Austin and LSQ, I think in the 90s or the 2000s, showing the voting patterns weren't that different, I think, in at-large and district elections in Texas. So it's not obvious to me that the log rolling increases. I get the argument, but I just would like to hear more, maybe more about why there's less log rolling in at-large systems. That'd be interesting. And then I have some thoughts also about Jeff's question I'm seeing too, because I had a guest speaker to my class last year who's one of the lawyers on the CVRA, who you've probably interviewed him already, but I'm persuaded that it's pretty exogenous in terms of how they choose the cities, and that the cities are by and large moving that direction. But anyways, can you talk more about the logic of at-large districts?
Yeah,
log rolling.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we are currently working to better measure is where the city council members come from and where their constituencies are located within the city. The kind of simplified model of it is in an at-large city, oftentimes council members are coming from a small quadrant of the city that is generally whiter, wealthier homeowners that are able to kind of dictate local elections when you have these abysmal turnout rates of 10, 20% or so. Whereas, so in that case, if you have policies with spatially concentrated costs, they may have some aspect of log rolling when it comes to their own kind of pet projects and decisions, but it is very easy just to drop the unwanted land use in these unrepresented neighborhoods. So log rolling may exist, but they're all just kind of protecting their own, issues within that microcosm of the 1/4 of the city that is turning out to vote at high levels. The idea with districts is that now you're forcefully splitting that so everyone has a constituency within each corner of the city. So if a log roll is still existing there, because again, log rolls can exist in different ways. Now it's a log roll that is blocking development in all corners of the city. And some of that can be good. It can force different types of conversations, but it's certainly going to make it harder to channel the unwanted land use into the place that people don't turn out to vote. And if they do turn out to vote, they are swamped by that one highly mobilized corner of the city that dominates the at-large elections.
That's cool. Can I ask one follow-up? Do you look at changes in contributions from the at-large district from developers? Like, would the developers' contribution strategies change?
No, we haven't. We haven't looked at that, but that's I'm sure there'd be something very interesting there.
Because that argument you just gave about that seems right from my qualitative experience of a few cities I know, that the people are all clustered in at-large elections in the same neighborhood, making decisions for the rest of the city, and then that changes with the district elections. But the contributions changing too might impact your log rolling argument, and would just be an interesting outcome.
Definitely. There's a lot of interesting stuff playing out right now, so we're very excited about it. I saw more questions in the chat box that I could read, but I'm worried that it'd be in silence. I'm happy to take them live.
Jeff, and then Pam, and then Henry.
Yeah, I've got. I wrote one to everyone, and then I didn't hit the right button. And then I wrote one just to Michael privately. but I'll read the one that I wrote to everyone. And this was me just kind of thinking through things as I was writing. Are there incentives for at-large cities to avoid being targeted for change? You had mentioned, that everything, that any city would lose in litigation. Can some cities do something? Do some at-large cities change their housing decisions a bit as a way to not be a target for litigation? And then as I was writing this, I was thinking through this. This could perhaps bias things toward a null result, right? Maybe making us have more confidence in the significant effects that you do find. So I don't know. That was just me thinking through as I was asking a question.
Yeah. So the I guess two things are reassuring for kind of the research design here. One is that there's really nothing that cities can do to avoid litigation, because these legal teams are looking at kind of the past, 10, 20 years of city council results and using that as additional evidence. But the evidence hurdle is so low because of the CVRA that really, once you're in the crosshairs, you either shift on your own, or if you receive a legal threat, that's kind of starts a clock where you have even more pressure to switch quickly. But importantly, when it comes to housing, housing is just completely unrelated to the CVRA and CVRA targeting. It's not discussed at all in the original legislation. It's not being discussed by lawyers. In fact, we were shocked when we did field work and we tried to, at the end of the interview, you try to just, kind of explain the theory, just see if there's anything we missed. And people really didn't understand what the CVRA had to do with housing, or that there'd be any effects downstream. So in that sense, not only is it not really on the radar, but it's hard to imagine that any change in housing housing policy would sway any of the lawyers or the legal process here. It is purely about you have 20% Latino population and you've had 0 Latinos on city council in the past 12 years. You need to change, and even then, everyone is changing once again in this crosshairs.
Within that set, right? Some cities have much more in the way of resources to fight litigation or to draw it out than others. Mm-hmm. Do the teams identify the low-hanging fruit first? The cities that would not be able to, essentially fight the litigation and delay. There's some timing issue, right? There has to be some choice and timing issue, right?
It's a bit hard because I think the cost of fighting this is so high that even wealthy cities are wary of trying to fight it in court. So what we've generally seen is that the legal teams, if anything, are trying to take on big cities that will send a message. I think Anaheim was one of the first cities targeted. So it's like it's a big wealthy city, but maybe it's also a particularly egregious case. But the other thing going on is that there's not really a great amount of strategy, because you have a bunch of other firms glomming onto this, and one in particular based in Malibu that is writing these letters as quickly as possible, because for each letter you send, you get $35,000 in legal fees paid for by the city council. Right, so you just have a cottage industry of sending these letters with kind of a boilerplate. This is why you're in violation of the CVRA, and then you get paid 35 grand, and you just crank out these letters. And so for that group in particular, this is kind of a funny thing we've learned through fieldwork, is that the strategic law firms are very mad at this cottage industry legal group, because they could any strategy is kind of out the window. So the net result of that is that when we put everything in a survival model to try to look at, is there a timing effect? Are certain places being targeted early? We essentially see that nothing's really predictive. Certainly none of these kind of legal capacity things are predictive of when a city has decided to switch.
Okay.
Sorry, that was very long-winded.
No, that was good.
I got excited about it.
Let me just ask the private question next, because it's related, I think. So this process, right, at-large to district elections, this seems like a blue state thing for the most part. What's going on in the red states? And do we have any examples of blue states that go red and then try to switch from district to at-large elections?
So we want to take a broader scope of this in future work. I'll say a couple things is that there's a contemporary paper with ours in economics, which looks at the shift to district elections with a kind of weaker identification strategy. It's just kind of cities that did switch from 1980 to 2016 over the entire country. And their point estimate on the multifamily housing is exactly the same as ours. I think it's off by 1 percentage point. So the outcome of this switch seems to be replicated across the country. What is happening in more redder states is that the cities there have high concentrations of African Americans. And in fact, there's a paper by Francisco Trebi, which looked at this in the American Southeast, that with the original Voting Rights Act, and that was being enforced in the 1980s, these cities wanted to keep at-large elections in order to protect their white majority on city council. But as white flight occurred and white residents started moving out of the city into the suburbs, all of a sudden, as soon as they hit a certain threshold, the white city councilors voted to switch to district elections because they knew they were about to get completely knocked out of city council. As soon as that minority population became the majority, they would take control. So it's like, whoa, we need a seat at the table now. So I think a lot of the dynamics are similar, but whether the conditions of housing politics and stuff may be slightly different.
Okay, Pam.
Sure. Actually, you answered. I had two questions. So the first was looking at how many local areas actually are majority individuals of color, because I think California would actually give you kind of an interesting look at that too. So you kind of answered that there. So I'd love to see you at least do some comparison with that. I mean, the research design is beautiful and it's a really interesting paper and a cool project. And my second was more of a comment, I guess, or maybe have you thought about. So your theory reminds me a lot of an old federalism theory. So the Confederation paper by Cremier and Palfrey, which, I don't know, 1996 or something like that, right? And in theirs, what they're looking at is voters' preferences for moving to a confederation as opposed to more centralized institutional setup. And for them, it's about ideology. And so where moderates are preferring centralization and extremists on both ends prefer the more decentralized approach to things. It just your theory reminds me a lot of that. And have you thought, like, if you back up one more step, which you don't have like the nice identification there perhaps, but the extent to which something beyond race or might matter too, and like size of the district, that seems, if I remember right, that was something that mattered in that paper as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think inherently, and this will open up probably feverish debate. Much of the political cleavages of cities are just come down to these racial divides, and a lot of that comes from the lack of strong party competition in the cities. So people use different cues and heuristics, and this is also compounded by racial segregation. Means that when it comes to your electoral coalitions, the race is tied with the spatial area if you want to get things or avoid things. I would say something that may speak to your first point about what are these compositions of cities, particularly in California, where there can be potentially high minority concentrations. Is my screen still up? I think it is. Yeah. So we can look at what the heterogeneity around these effects. And what we see, and this is just using a tercile approach again, we can see that in areas of low minority and high minority, and we see the circle is the full sample of California cities. The triangle is that subset of eventually treated cities. They look the same. Not a statistically significant difference just because you have so much noise around these low minority areas. It just means something else is going on in those areas that is we don't quite have a handle on with our observables. But yeah, if anything, this kind of supports that you need one of the arguments about the CVRA is that districts are not right for everyone. If you don't have enough minorities, and they're not concentrated enough, you can draw all day. You're not going to get a district which is able to secure a seat at the table. You can still have that type of racially polarized white representation. And so that's kind of borne out by these results, but mainly we just get it gets much more noisy in these low segregated areas. You may have trouble drawing those this thing. So I think that's something we're going to look at more, but these are just the first cut of that.
Okay, then we have Henry, if you want to ask, and then Nico and Christian.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so my question is, we know that generally speaking, city councils tend to vote in unanimity on most issues. In your research, did you see did you see any changes in sort of that unanimous percentages between at-large versus districted? And do you see that the districted cities might perhaps tokenize the minority members with the predominant majority race council members, basically outvoting them 4-1 or 3-2 or similarly in your research?
Yeah, so on the first point, when going through the council meeting minutes, I initially started recording the vote shares on these specific proposals, but as you pointed out, there's such unanimous things that it seemed like, the small savings per city council meeting add up to a lot when you're looking at 2,000 meetings. So I just kind of stopped recording those 7-0 votes all the time. So we don't have evidence of that. I didn't notice it visually when going through it, that there were more splits. But and a lot of that's just signaling. Like a lot of developers know it's a very time-consuming process, and if they're not confident in getting that 7-0 outcome, they're just going to not even submit the proposal. But in terms of tokenizing, we haven't noticed that either. However, that in interviews, particularly in Anaheim, there was a suggestion that had occurred with the Dr. Jose Moreno, who got on city council. Said this log roll, there's more nuances to it than we are thinking through. And so we do want to be aware of that going forward, but we don't have exact data on that right now.
Hi, thanks for presenting this. I think it's super interesting. So my question is kind of about your identification and construction of a counterfactual group. So one of the necessary conditions for a successful lawsuit pursuant to the CVRA is that there's racially polarized voting within the city. So by design, racial polarization is going to be correlated with the treatment. And it's likely also correlated with the outcome if these highly segregated places before treatment are probably more likely to be concentrating housing in minority districts. So I guess when you're matching or constructing a counterfactual in any other way, like in your eventually treated group, to what extent can you overcome that confound? Or should we interpret these results as only among racially polarized cities? And if that's the case, like what does that do to your prediction about the effect of the top-down mandate?
The evidence of racially polarized voting, it's kind of, there doesn't seem to be much of a gray area, like a scale in it. Essentially in all these cities, there's enough racially polarized voting for them to be subject to the treatment. I haven't really seen that kind of derail or any of the lawyers saying they didn't find enough evidence of racially polarized voting, just because that's kind of the cleavage in local politics, lacking party labels. These are nonpartisan elections. To the second point, within the survival model, we do look at past Latino success, which is not exactly racially polarized voting, but some of these measures of past Latino success, we find that once we look in that eventually treated subset, past Latino success is not predictive of the eventual decision to switch. So I'm not as concerned that something else may be going on there, but it is something to consider.
What is the threshold for racially polarized voting? How do we know it when we see it?
I think I should look at my notes from speaking with some of these lawyers. My sense is that it is, it's a bit like gerrymandering, where you it's very hard to come up with a firm definition. And I think as optimistic as the CVRA writers were, I think what we're seeing in the kind of litigation is that almost anything counts as racially polarized voting. I haven't looked at the original documents to see what the exact test is that they're using.
Christian, you wanted to follow?
Sure. I mean, I would say there's some political science literature that actually says what racially polarized voting is, and you might want to look at it. It's a pretty diverse group of scholars who've written about it for about 20 or 30 years. And so I wouldn't just say the lawyer said you can do about anything. From my understanding in CVRA, you have to have a majority of one group voting for a candidate that is not being voted on by a majority of the other group. And so it's pretty straightforward, and anything does go. So I agree with you in terms of your take on it, but I would sort of bolster that with some literature and political science. Like if we presented to the court a candidate getting a majority of Latino, Asian American, and white voter support, that wouldn't be racially polarized voting. The court wouldn't accept it. However, in California, in almost every city that's been sued, there is racially polarized voting where the minority group supports a candidate that differs from the candidate supported by the majority group. So I think it's fair what you've said, that any city that's sued is actually getting treated in response to Nico's point. But I think in practice, you could have cities that don't have racially polarized voting. Or I'm sorry, in theory, you could have cities that don't have racially polarized voting, but in practice, most of them do. And it's pretty easy to establish that they do, as you said. But I'd just be more careful about sort of the establishment of such racially polarized voting. It goes back, I think, like Quiet Revolution in the South, and Morgan Couser and a bunch of other people have done a lot of work on this. And it's it'd just be good to hearken to the political scientists who've worked in the area. And that's, even though I realize they're not looking at housing. So that's kind of I guess it's kind of my point. It might be good to reference that somewhere.
Yeah, I definitely will brush up on that. I thank you for those suggestions, and yeah, I agree.
Just related to that, have you talked to Morgan Couser for your qualitative work?
My co-author Asya has several times, but I have not spoken directly with him.
Because what I understand is Kevin Schenkman, who's the Malibu lawyer, and correct me if I'm wrong here, goes to Morgan and asks him what city should we sue, and then Morgan does something and tells him what cities to sue and what cities to send letters to. And then I asked Kevin more about that, and he wouldn't tell, Kevin Schenkman, the lawyer, he wouldn't tell me anything else beyond that. And so I'm convinced of everything you're saying, that I don't think they're thinking particularly strategically and leaving cities on the table that don't have racially polarized voting, but Morgan is doing something and figuring out something about how to sue. So it'd be cool to maybe get Morgan on the record to help establish that of which cities are getting the letters.
Christian, you had a couple other things here that you want to follow up on a bit?
Oh no, that was it. That was it's all related to the racially polarized voting. Where I think in practice, I agree with you entirely, Michael, that basically any city in California would have racially polarized voting, but it'd be good to bolster that claim a little bit more.
Yeah, I think your other points, and I'll state them. Maybe you don't want to, but this was not a case where an economist like Trebi came along and discovered something that political scientists were not working on for quite some time. So I think Christian's other point is maybe cite a little bit more of the political science literature that was out there before.
Yeah, that's
right?
what I was
Miguel?
His question is more out of curiosity. Can you tell us a bit more about how you created the eventually treated subgroups? Is this simply subsetting to cities that switched over the period covered? If so, what exactly is this adding beyond the city level fixed effects that you use, I think, in the full sample?
Yeah, so with the eventually treated subset, we're looking at cities that have agreed to switch. So we think that these cities, so that's the first cutoff, is that have they either been targeted, or oftentimes cities hear, hey, this next city 20 miles over is being targeted. We need to switch now so we don't have to deal with any sort of legal fees that we'd pay the law firm. So that's the first cutoff. And we think those cities may be more similar to each other than cities that are not on anyone's radar to be targeted. And so so they either switched already or they're going to switch in 2021, 2022. The next cutoff is we're going to look at the attributes, because within that cutoff, there's still timing effects. There's still strategy that may be being used by these law firms. So then we use the cutoff that we got from one of the lead firms that kind of initiated the CVRA to begin with back in 2001. And they said, we're really looking at cities with at least 20% of the population being Latino, and then also with more than 50,000 people. And once we use that cutoff, those cities, the timing seems as if random. None of our variables about past Latino success, Latino home ownership rates, all these other kind of variables in the model, nothing is statistically significant. I think maybe median income it's a little noisy. And so that gives us more confidence that there's the timing here is giving us that exogeneity, so we can compare within that subset.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Michael. It was great to have you. I think it went off really well. I'm cautiously optimistic on Zoom now going forward for the workshop. I think, aside from a couple little quirks, I think it worked really well. Really great presentation, cool paper. And thanks for kicking this off in the 2021 academic year.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure, especially talking about something that is both broad, but also, I'm sure, personally experienced by many of you in Southern California. So it's an exciting audience to talk to.